Buongiorno e benvenuti a questo incontro su democrazia e sviluppo.
Good morning and welcome, good afternoon indeed, and welcome to this conference on democracy and development. We have the pleasure of having with us Professor Torsten PERSSON. There's no need to introduce Professor PERSSON, frankly, or at least there wouldn't be in a meeting of academics, but he is the director of the Institute for National Institute for Academic Studies, and he has been the professor at the London School of Economics. He's one of the founding fathers of political economics. This is part of economic literature that has been developing very much over the past 10 or 15 years. It's very interesting indeed, as we will see today. In addition to addressing the key question of economics, i.e. what consumers do, what households do, what companies do, it also focuses more on what policymakers do. So this is a different perception, a different standpoint to understand where countries are going. He gave a major contribution to this, particularly with this book called Political Economics, Explaining Economic Policy, which has been the Bible of political economics. Professor PERSSON, in addition to contributing to the development of political economics, has also been focusing on a number of other areas, macroeconomics, monetary policy, and so on. He received a number of awards. I mentioned just a few of them, otherwise that would take us hours. He is a member. He has been president of the European Economic Association in 2003 and is a member of the Nobel Prize for Economics, is one of the people that select the people to award the Nobel Prize. He also received the award for the best younger economist. Youngest means under 45, and that was in 1997. I want to give you an impression that Professor PERSSON comes from like the moon, if you know what I mean. I also met him in a different situation in Cancun at the Latin American Econometric Society, and I realized that he plays soccer excellently. So I can today introduce to you the Ibrahimovic of economics.
Thank you for coming, and thank you, Vincenzo, for that very nice introduction. It's the kind of thing you want your mother to hear, and then she might even believe it. So. Okay, so before starting, let me tell you that the research I'll be reporting on here today is almost exclusively joint work with an Italian economist, Guido Tabellini, who was earlier lecturing in this festival. I guess Guido is in the news these days because he has become the new rector of Bocconi University, but you should know that outside of Italy, he's probably the most renowned economist alive and working today. So you can blame Guido for any errors that I say. Okay, so my topic is democracy and development. And I think that it's fair to say that the last 200 years have been exceptional, at least from a social science standpoint, for mankind. So these are the 200 years in which the world has seen economic growth take off in a number of countries. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened everywhere, so not every country is blessed with having sustained growth. And where it happened, it didn't really happen at the same time. And when it happened, it didn't always turn out to be a sustainable path of growth. So these heterogeneities in the experiences of countries means that today we observe really huge differences in living standards if we look across the globe. You can say almost the same thing about political change. So these 200 years were the time in mankind where democracy as a governing system was introduced. Unfortunately, that didn't happen in every country. And when it happened at different times. And when it happened, it didn't always happen in a consolidated way. So some countries had to make a return to other forms of rule. And as a result, today we observe huge differences in the democratic experience that we have in various countries on the globe. So there are some big questions here. You know, why are some countries rich? Why are some countries poor? Why are some countries stable democracies, others stable autocracies, and others plagued by this kind of regime-shifting political instability? And of course, each of these questions have been the topic of much research, research made by economists, by political scientists, by economic and political historians over a long time. So my topic today is a little bit smaller than these big questions, not much. So I want to focus on the relation between the two. You know, we see economic change, we see political change. Are the two related? Somehow, in our gut, in our stomach, we feel that that ought to be the case, that there is a positive connection between the two. But, you know, can we say something more on the basis of science about this question? So the best thing then is to start by taking a look at the data. And if you look at the data, you see a pretty strong association between living standards today and democratic experience today. So let me show you a graph that shows that relation for about 155 countries in the year 2000. So this picture, as they say, says more than 1,000 words. So let me try and explain what you see in front of you, or if you want to look in your handout. So this is living standards and democratic experience in 155 countries as we measure it in the year 2000. So each red dot in this diagram would be a country. Okay? On the vertical axis, going upwards, you will see a measure of living standards, which is just income per head in that economy in the year 2000. So each dot in that dimension, the upward dimension, reflects how much economic growth each country had in the past, by and large. And when you look at the scale, you should observe that this is like a logarithmic scale. So from the observation on the top to the right, which is the US, to the observation to the left bottom, that's about 5 steps. And that translates into a difference of 150 times. So 150 times richer is the US than Chad in the year 2000. So this is simply mind-boggling, and you see the differences there. On the horizontal axis, we plot a simpler to understand measure. This is democratic experience, measured simply as the number of years that the country has been in democracy since the year 1800. Okay, and as you see, there's a great variation in that dimension as well. And at least to me, I think to you as well, this graph shows a positive relation. So, you know, on average, richer countries have more democratic experience. But perhaps the most striking aspect of this graph is this triangular shape. It looks like a triangle, right? And in particular, it shows that having long democratic experience guarantees you, it seems, or it's associated at least, with high income. Whereas to have high income is not necessary to have long democratic experience. As you see on the left, countries with very little democratic experience are both poor and rich. So, if you like, the research that I'll talk about is trying to explain the forces behind that led up to this situation and what we can say about it. Now, if we think about the reasons for observing a positive relation, then by pure logic there are three possibilities, I guess. So one is that democracy fosters economic growth. For example, under democracy there are more stable and perhaps more favorable conditions for investment due to more better policies or more predictable policies, and this gives more growth on average than in other forms of government. The second possibility is that higher income fosters democracy. So this could be, for example, that as people get richer, they have a higher desire for freedom and non-material values as their living standards improve. And that's a well-known theme. It's actually a label called modernization theory in political science, going back to Seymour Lipset and Sidney Verba and others in the 1960s that had this precisely this flavor. The third possibility is that there's something else that explains both. So, the relation that we observe in that graph is simply spurious. So, historical circumstance, luck, or some colonial heritage promote sustained growth as well as stable democracy. So, we look and we see a relation, but it's really driven by something else. So, over the last few decades, historians, economists, and political scientists have offered all of these three explanations. They have done it at different points in time. They have done it with different degrees of force, and they, I would say, have backed up their strong claims with different amounts of data. So, all in all, I think it's still true that we know surprisingly little of this joint dynamics of economic and political change. But, we have a clue that life is pretty complicated here. So what's the right answer? I think at the end of the day, it will be a portion of all three. So yes, income fosters democracy to some degree. Yes, democracy fosters growth to some degree. And yes, there are other factors that sort of help explain both, but we need to get a little further than that vague statement. And a clue that these things are not so simple you get from considering the histories of those 155 countries, the paths leading up to the situation in today's situation in 2000, as I showed you in the graph. And when you start considering those histories, you see that there's not a single story here. There's no determinism, because the relative timing of political regime changes and economic growth, when it took off, they differ quite a bit. And so I'll try to lead you through a few examples just to drive home that point. I should say that the sources for looking at these histories are two really fantastic data sets that have taken many man-years of work. So for economic growth, the best and most comprehensive data source is the database constructed by Angus Madison, which he has worked on since the 80s. And in that database, you find data on annual income levels per head going back to 1820 for some countries. The other data source is for long-term political data. This is the so-called polity data set. It has now a label 4, meaning it's the fourth wave in a sequence of studies. This is a project that was started by Ted Gurr, who is now at Maryland. He's been at Michigan before, started in the 70s, and basically gives data about political institutions in each year for all countries that are independent and has more than 500,000 inhabitants since the year 1800. So both of these are very good data sources, and I'm using them extensively. So now let's look at a few examples. So this is another type of plot for GDP and democratic experience in the United Kingdom as we measure it. So I'll be showing a few of these. So let me explain how this graph too is constructed. So you have on the horizontal axis, you have time, and as you see, we measure it from the year 1800 until 2000. On the right scale, rightward scale, we measure the same income as before, so that's log of GDP per capita, or log of income per head. And the jagged blue curve shows the development of England's income from 1820, when the data starts, up to the year 2000. Here. On the left scale is the measure of democratic experience, i.e. the years of democracy since 1800. And so that's the red curve that you see underneath. So if we begin with economic events, particularly if you look at spot-wise data that are available before this time period, you see that there seemed to be a kink in the 1830s or such. That's the conventional dating of, when long-term growth started in Britain. And from that year, say 1830, 1835, there is pretty steady growth all to this day. Yes, there are some ups and downs, small wiggles on the curve. You can see the depression in the 1930s, and you can see the post-war repression as well. But by and large, this is sustained economic growth since the 1830s. As for the red curve, it starts at zero, so 0 years of democratic experience. But then in 1837, was something called the First Reform Act, when the franchise was extended, Parliament got more representative of the people that voted, and in our definition of democracy, England became a democracy at that date and has never retreated since then. So democratic experience just increases by 1 year for each subsequent year. There's no dictatorship after this. And in this case, it looks as if, economic growth and democratic experience start accumulating at the same time, right? This is instead my own country, Sweden, where, as you can see, the takeoff or the beginning of sustained growth is little bit later, so maybe around 1870, 1875. This previously poor agrarian economy starts to industrialize, and from then on, it's sustained growth ever after. Our democratization is considerably later than in the UK. So in 1910, this is the breakthrough of parliamentarism, universal suffrage, and so we code that to be the start of Swedish democracy, but then there's no relapse, and we build democratic experience, and by now it's almost 100 years. Should show you Italy, of course, since we are here. So this is from the start of the Italian state in early 1860s. And as you can see, there's standstill in economic growth initially. Then where you want to date Italian growth or income growth to start is a matter of taste, I guess. So around 1900, there are 20 years of improvement. But then, on the other hand, there is 30 years of stagnation. And you see the deep dip in the immediate post-war period. And then, for sure, economic growth takes off in a sustained pace right after the war. And on the bottom, it's democratic experience, no democracy until the introduction of the Republic, the birth of which we celebrate today. And from then on, democracy ever since. So in this case, either you say that democracy, introduction of democracy and long-term democratic experience coincides with economic growth takeoff, or you say that the economic growth began a little earlier, depending on how you want to see things. So now, here is a country with a little bit more of an eventful political history than those we have seen so far. So this is Argentina. So now you see that the that the red curve with democratic experience has a lot of flats. In fact, there are 5 flats on that curve, right? So this means that during this time, since its inception in the late 1820s, Argentina went through 5 periods of democracy and 5 periods of autocracy. So it's a pretty stable period from 1880s to the 1930s when things are going well. Democracy is a weak democracy, but regular elections, 2 parties fighting over power. And then, you know, the trouble starts in the late 1930s. That's the Perón in and Perón out period, repeated coups and the military takeover. And it's not until 1983 when the election of Alfonsín introduces democracy, and we have had it again for the last 25 years. If you look at Argentine economic growth, you see that the beginning looks pretty good. And in fact, around 1940, 1945, before the war, Argentina is one of the 5 richest countries in the world at that time. Then I think you can see that there is a slowdown during this period of political trouble, and it's not clear that there's been a very sustained recovery yet. So now Italy has Argentina has slipped, so no longer among the 5 richest countries in the world, rather like a third of the income level of, say, the US or such. So in this case, there is, you know, it's more troublesome, but perhaps one can say that the period of instability and lots of political change coincides with the slowdown of economic growth. Here is another Latin American country to show you that all of Latin America is not, you know, political. This is Costa Rica, one of the oldest democracies in the world. It's a little bit contested. Our criterion has Costa Rica being democratic from the 1840s. Others would say it's from the 1880s, but still, by any means, it's one of the oldest democracies in the world. And here, the economic data doesn't start until 1950, or sorry, 1920 or so. But we see that the takeoff definitely doesn't happen until, say, 1950. So maybe 70 or 100 years after democracy was introduced. So here, it's income growth that is lagging democracy. A couple of more examples. So this is just to remind us of the other part of the globe. So this is Uganda, one of the countries that became independent after decolonization in the 1960s. As you can see, there are some flats there, a couple of failed democratic experiments in the 1960s and 1970s. And it would be hard to say that Uganda has entered the era of sustained economic growth. In fact, it's poor, very poor still, and if you just compare, that level is about half the level of Sweden, say, in around 1820, when Sweden was a poor European country. This graph is Singapore, which remind us that not all countries that became independent in the 1960s are doomed to failure. On the contrary, there's this spectacular boom of economic growth. So now Singapore is one of the richest countries in the world, but unfortunately it never entered a democratic phase. Still not a free country, politically free country, as you can see from the flat portion there. And the last picture is of China, which of course never entered democracy either. There was actually a failed attempt. There's a little bit blip on the graph in 1913. This is with Kuomintang trying to introduce. So it's half a year of free elections, democracy, but then it's authority again. And so not a democracy, but spectacular economic growth, at least in the last 35 years. All right. So what can we sort of learn from these histories about this main question, the relation between economic and political change? So that's the theme of the research. And it involves theoretical as well as empirical research and exploits these rich data sources on economic and political variation that I alluded to, the Madison and the Polity4 data sets. And you know, these pictures, these glimpses of history that you looked at should tell you already that any such credible research strategy must pay a close attention to differences across countries, because it's not a universal experience that we have seen. One must pay close attention to differences in institutions, differences in history, differences in geography, differences in culture. And what the research tries to do is to try and make sense of, you know, can we say something systematic about the patterns in the data while paying attention, keen attention to these differences across countries. And I'll try to give you examples, actually 6 examples of empirical results that we have found in this endeavor. So the first result deals with this question, whether the introduction of democracy promotes economic growth. And a problem here is that once you start looking at the data, you see that occurrence of reforms is not a random event. So every country is not equally likely to either enter into a state of democracy or exit out of democracy. And of course, this can be problematic from the viewpoint of statistical measurement, because if it's systematically the case that those countries enter democracy where democracy works well, and those countries exit where democracy doesn't work so well, then your inference will be biased by this fact, and you're not going to get the right conclusion. So sometimes one wishes that you know, experiments could be done. So it would be great if we could, you know, do a medical field study here and, you know, make 1,000 hypothetical countries swallow the pill of democracy, just select them randomly, and then the other 1,000 would swallow some other pill, which is not democracy, and then we'll just compare what happens. But of course, this is not the world that we live in, so we cannot make such experiments. So what one has to do instead is to be careful in the statistical methodology, and what we try to do is to create a kind of statistical laboratory, if you like. I'm not going to go into technical details, but essentially one wants to look at countries that are like twins. They have similar conditions, so they are equally likely to enter into democracy at a given point in time. Some do, some don't. And if you compare across those countries, then you're more likely to get the right answer than if you compare across everybody, right? So that's the research design in a very, very simplified way. So anyway, so what we find when we do this and takes this heterogeneity seriously is that there is, in fact, a positive growth effect on average entering into democracy. And the average effect is that after reform, where democracy was introduced, growth is about 1% higher than otherwise. Then we can also look at what happens of those that, you know, relapse, go from democracy to autocracy, have a turnaround in the political regime. And here, the average growth effect is negative. On average, about 2% per year is the growth rate lower once you relapse into autocracy. But I should emphasize that these growth effects are highly heterogeneous, so there's a significant dispersion around these means, which we tease out of the data. So that's one finding. The second finding is, you know, looking at all reforms not being alike. So it makes common sense that whether democracy has a productive effect on economic growth probably depends a lot on what policies are being pursued, and in particular what economic reforms are being pursued after the change or in connection with the change. So part of this work looks at large-scale economic reforms in the form of economic liberalizations. Actually, there's some work by Francesco Giavazzi and Tabellini that is also underlying what we have done further here. And what you find then is that having a political liberalization, that gives you 1% more growth, as we saw on the previous slide. Having an economic liberalization, meaning opening up the economy to foreign trade and investment, capital flows, gives about an equally large growth effect, about 1% extra growth per year if the economy is liberalized. So you'd think that if you do the two things together, then you get 2%, 1 plus 1. But that turns out to be not really the case, or at least when you dig a little bit deeper. The sequence in which you liberalize the political system and the economic system is very important. So you can do it in two ways: the economy before the polity, or the polity before the economy. And if you do the economic liberalization before the political one, then it's a huge effect. It's not 2%, it's 3.5% extra growth. On the other hand, if you do the opposite, so the democracy is introduced before the economy is opened up, then the effect is almost zero. So the 2% is the average of 3.5 and 0, or 3.5 and a half, or something like this. But it matters a lot depending on how you do it. And real-world examples of countries that did it or didn't do it is South Korea, that liberalized the economy before the polity. Philippines, neighboring country to South Korea, did the opposite. Chile liberalized the economy before democracy was introduced. Argentina did the opposite. And I guess you know that South Korea and Chile belong to the success stories, and the Philippines and Argentina are perhaps not such success stories. Another aspect in which democratic reforms are not the same is that, what type of democracy you introduce obviously can matter as well. Okay? So in this research, we look at what type of democracy is being introduced. You can introduce a democracy with a certain electoral system or another, and you can introduce a democracy which is a parliamentary democracy or a presidential democracy. These are the two archetypes that we often talk about in this literature, and I guess in public discussions as well. So if you look at the introduction of presidential versus parliamentary form of government of a democratic nature, then you see immediately that the presidential democracy has a much stronger growth effect. So the difference that you get on average in growth is 1.5% higher if you introduce a presidential democracy rather than a parliamentary one. So you may wonder why that happens, and there's some underlying theory that motivated us to carry out this empirical work, and that theory suggests that different political systems systematically choose different economic policies, and the data seem to support that hypothesis. So if you look at, for example, at government spending after the introduction of democracy, it's much bigger in parliamentary democracy than presidential democracy, up to 5% of total income, higher spending in parliamentary democracy after the reform than in presidential democracy. So if you think that big government is not always good for the economy, then that's a possibility. The other thing you can detect is that parliamentary democracy is much more likely to do the liberalization of the economy after the political reform rather than the other way around. And as we saw on the previous slide, that was not so conducive to better economic performance. So there are some clues in that data. The fourth result is another dimension of growth of reforms. Namely, some reforms come just by circumstances. They come as a total surprise. Other reforms tend to become very expected. So when Franco was ousted in 1975, every Spaniard knew that this was coming up, and they had prepared for that event for a long time, whereas some third world leader dies in a random shooting, and so happens that democracy gets introduced, can come as a complete lightning from heaven. So what difference does it make? Then simple theory tells you that people's anticipation is very important. In particular, is very important for their investment behavior. Okay, so suppose people know that democracy is coming and that it will bring better results. Then, of course, that increases the expected return to investment, and it makes people invest already before the reform, because anticipation, making themselves prepared for what is coming. And this influences growth. So we try to find if that idea is true in the data. It's not so easy to do this, because you must measure in this 200-year perspective what people's anticipation of whether there was going to be a reform or not, and that's a difficult task. But what we try to do is to somehow, from the data, estimate the probability of a reform taking place. And then we assume that we, as statisticians, looking at the data 200 years, we know something, but the people who live in the economy, they know at least as much. So we can use the measured likelihood of having the reform as a measure of expectations. And when we do that, we find an interesting result, namely that if you are in democracy and the probability of a coup or a relapse into autocracy goes down, then growth accelerates. So if people are more sure that the democracy is consolidated, you see an effect on both investment and economic growth. In autocracy, you don't find any such effect of expectations. So if democracy becomes more likely, if anything, there's a negative effect. So there's an asymmetry here across democracies and autocracies. Two more items on the list. This is the famous modernization hypothesis. Does income make democracy more likely? So here what we do is that we, as I explained before, we try to estimate the probability of seeing a change, either a switch from autocracy to democracy or the other way around in a given year. And then we relate how this probability is influenced by different political and economic factors, and in particular income in this instance, right? And here we again find an asymmetry. So the modernization hypothesis doesn't seem to hold water in the data, because there's no effect of income in autocracy. So becoming richer doesn't make it any likelier that democratization happens. But we do find in democracy a clear consolidation effect. Okay, so if you're democratic, then higher income progressively makes a coup that make a relapse into autocracy less and less likely, although this finding is perhaps a bit contested by other researchers. Depends a little bit on how you measure democracy. Okay. So the final result is this stuff about democratic experience that we looked at. So what is the effect of having been a democracy for a long time of surviving as a democracy? So compared to societies that are at similar income levels, say, but they have very different number of years of democratic history. So say, compare Costa Rica to Paraguay or another country with a more autocratic history. Then we find that that democratic experience in the past is very important, in the sense that if you're in democracy, having had a lot of democracy in the past, cuts the probability that you'll go into autocracy. So it consolidates democracy further. And in autocracy, it does indeed raise the probability of exit. So if Costa Rica and Paraguay would both go back to autocratic rule by some bad coincidence, the prediction would be that Costa Rica had a much bigger chance of returning faster than Paraguay had, because of its much longer democratic experience. And it's easy to think that why this would happen. In fact, Tabellini and I, who have done this work, we have minted the concept of democratic capital to measure the fact that you're building up experience with democracy, so people's values change over time when they see how democracy works, and perhaps also the institutions are being built that will facilitate the return to democracy. So people become more prepared to stand up and defend democracy if they have higher democratic capital, meaning that they have more democratic experience. Turns out you also see an effect of not only the history of democracy, but the geography of democracy. So if you're surrounded by many democracies, you're more likely to consolidate your own. So that's the Ukraine effect, if you like. Okay, so these were 6 glimpses of research results that I give you. So what do we make of these findings? Well, first, the qualifications. So all of these results are pretty recent, and I'm sure they're going to be scrutinized by many others, and some will survive, perhaps others won't, but I think they are quite suggestive. All these results suggest that heterogeneity is quite important. So as I write on the slide, all democratic reforms are not the same. And even if you have the same reform, it doesn't have the same effects in every time and in every place. So it's very important to keep that in mind. It's not a deterministic world. It's a multifaceted world. So as they say in English, the devil is in the details of what's going on. But I guess we are making progress in understanding the devil a little bit, and what exactly difference in reforms do make a difference, as I've been giving you a few examples of. So we find some systematic patterns in the data. Now, finally, let's now return to this big puzzle that I posed by showing you this first graph. So recall this scatter plot that we began with. So now, if you think about findings number 1 and findings number 5, that was basically that the effect of autocracy on growth varies a lot. And secondly, that there is no effect of becoming richer on the probability of exiting from democracy. So both these results tell you that you should observe autocracies at all income levels, right? If the effect of autocracy on growth varies a lot, then we see after a while very different income levels coming up. If it is the case that higher income, becoming richer, doesn't help you exit from autocracy, then countries stay autocratic, even though their income go in different directions. So that's, to me, the leftmost part of that graph, where countries with very, very limited democratic experience are found at all income levels, right? So we see Chad at the bottom, we see Singapore at the top. None of them have ever been a democracy, but this is just evidence that autocracy is not bad for every country in the world. It's good in some instances. Of course, we don't know how Singapore would have fared. Having been a democracy, maybe even better, but at least it's better than Chad. So that's a way to interpret that pattern in the data. Now, we had some other findings, so I labeled them 1 to 3. They basically said that if you enter in democracy, you have a positive growth effect on average. If you enter in autocracy, you have a negative growth effect on average. But not all democratic reforms have the same effect. It really matters, right? So this suggests that there should be a positive association between having been in democracy and your income level, because you grow more than if you're not. And the same thing with autocracy, but the opposite sign. Okay? So that perhaps helps explain the middle portion of the graph, where you see this positive slope, where longer democratic experience is associated with higher income levels. But it's not a linear thing. It's quite different for different countries. Then finally, we have these findings that I labeled 4 to 6, which said that in a democracy, both your income level, if it gets higher, and your democratic experience, if it gets higher, helps consolidate democracy. And then I also said that a more consolidated democracy makes expectations of a coup lower, and this in turn has a positive effect on economic growth. So in fact, this is the optimistic note, I think, here, that this suggests that you can have a virtuous circle. You know, a country enters in democracy, perhaps by chance or just by historical coincidence, and then it stays for a while. Okay, this brings some economic growth. The economy starts growing. This, in turn, raises income, which makes it less likely to relapse into autocracy. So there's no relapse into autocracy for the sake of the argument. So there's more democratic experience. This, too, makes it less likely that you'll return to autocracy. And so you keep growing. And then, you know, there's a positive feedback in both directions. And eventually, you consolidate your democracy and a high income level. And perhaps this is what we see in the very rightmost part of the graph, where no country with a long democratic experience is poor anymore. Right. So the final note, I think these questions can be no doubt that they are important. I think they are fascinating out of general curiosity and also as a researcher. But they are difficult, so I think we should be very humble how much we can learn. And as I say there, we are certainly not in the position to go to the World Bank and prescribe a blueprint for reform of country X in year Y, exactly what reforms should be pursued. But you know, we are accumulating some knowledge about how political change and economic change interacts. And I think this, in particular, this possibility of a virtuous circle is a reason to be optimistic. In troubled regions, we can have joint economic and political progress when conditions are right. Perhaps in Africa, you know, we have Botswana, we have Mauritius, that have been democratic for 40 years, and that are by now middle-income countries in a continent that is otherwise plagued by all sorts of problems. So I stop on that optimistic note.
Grazie per questa.
Thank you very much, Professor PERSSON, for your very interesting lecture, which gave us a note of optimism. In accordance with this data, we are a young democracy, so if we continue to be democratic, we may have more chances to grow economically. Now, I think there is time for some questions. You can make questions in Italian or in English, as you please. Could we have a microphone, please? Thank you. You're making your question in Italian or in English? In Italian, okay. I'd like to ask you how people should act in those countries where we want to export democracy. What is your perception? What can be your suggestions, apart from the indications given by international organizations? What is your personal opinion?
And, you know, international organizations have indeed insisted a lot on democratic reform in the last 10 to 15 years. So before, you never heard the World Bank or the IMF talk about democratic reforms, but now they do it. And I'm not sure that the result is everywhere fantastic. I think it's important to understand that democracy is not only about having elections. there's a superficial form of democracy where you only have elections, and perhaps the elections are rigged, and perhaps the result of the elections are not being respected. So, in fact, the measure that we are using in this study to define democracy has more than free and reasonably fair elections. It had also things like, from how wide a segment of the population are the candidates taken. So is there open entry in politics? What constraints are there on a ruling government once it has been installed? So I think it's important, if you want to make recommendations of democracies, you don't only look at the fact that you have a ballot, but you need to have a framework that makes political life civilized in these other dimensions as well. So I think that would be my personal opinion.
Senza violare la privacy.
Could you tell us what are the countries on the top right of your graph?
Yeah, I should have had one of these where you mark the countries, but I think so. The one on the very top, that's the United States. So it's, according to our measure, democratic from 1800 and onwards, and it has the highest income. Then you have United Kingdom, the next one down, and below United Kingdom you have this Costa Rica. So it's not rich compared to England, but it's rich compared to the rest of Latin America. Then my guess is that the next two would be Switzerland, Denmark, and I'm not really sure. Some other European nations, such as the Netherlands, probably, and Belgium.
And what we can...
The question is in English.
Your shape is that maybe economic growth brings democracy, or democracy brings economic growth, but it seems no hope of democracy in a nation, a poor nation. Is it true?
It is, but this is the situation now. So this is in a spotlight in a given year. And then, of course, many of these poor nations are new nations, so they didn't have much time yet. Democratic reforms of sorts have taken place in poor parts of the world, in Africa in particular. There are these long-standing democracies, such as I mentioned, Mauritius, Botswana, South Africa came next, and in the 1990s you have other places like Benin, Ivory Coast. Others became more democratic. So it's a little bit early to tell, because they are have a few years of democratic experience, and we don't really know what happens to their economies. Perhaps it takes a while for the traces to be seen. In fact, you can look at other things, other outcome variables, and not only economics. So you can look at health, and there's some work by Tim Wesley and Masayuki Kudamatsu that suggests that having democratic experience also helps to bring better health to the population. So mortality is going down, and once you have a democratic reform, infant mortality dives pretty quickly. And perhaps we see those results of other aspects of societal life quicker than we see, catching up with Europe, which is obviously a process that will take many, many decades to materialize.
Altre domande?
Any other questions? Well, if there are no other questions from the floor, I would take the opportunity of putting a question myself.
This autocracy. I mean, I'm sure that there could be different ways of looking into this box of autocracy, and to see whether there are different type of regime actually bring different.
Yeah, that's also a very good question. So, it's democracy for all its faults is most often a rules-based system. So, there will be some rules, they would be followed more or less, and we can talk about different forms of democracy because we believe that the electoral system is meaningful, that this distinction between presidential and parliamentary is meaningful. But then if we only contrast that with the autocracy, we're contrasting that with everything else. And obviously, autocracies are very, very different. There are military autocracies, there are other types, and I don't think we have a good clue about that. And the reason we don't have a clue is that measurement is hard because these are non-rules-based systems. So what you expect then is that, things like personalities, the leadership in itself, is it a good leader or is it a bad leader, that will matter all the more. My guess is that we could get somewhere by looking into how leadership changes in autocracy. So the question is whether there is some accountability of the leader to the people. My guess is that the well-functioning autocracies, even though they don't have popular elections, at least have a feedback process where a useless leader is being moved to the side and a better person comes in. It's one of the great virtues of democracy is that it's a selection mechanism. Often people think about democracy as being just about representing people's interests, but it's also a civilized way of moving to the side a leader that is not putting in the effort that they should, or that is not right for the task at hand. And this is often forgotten. That's the accountability part of democracy. And so my guess is that those autocracies that work, they have a kind of accountability mechanism through whichever group that is making the selection of the leader effectively. So I think that's where one should start the study.
Ringraziamo il professor Persson. Se non ci sono...
Thank you very much, Professor Persson. And if there are no other questions, I think we can close this session.